A farmer spotted a strange hole on his land and climbed in. What he found left him shaken. Bobby Wayne lived a quiet life in the countryside. His farm had been in his family for years. Every morning, he followed the same routine. He drank his coffee, checked the weather, and walked outside to inspect the fields. His days were mostly peaceful. He enjoyed the fresh air, the sound of birds, and the rhythm of farm work. There were no surprises on most days, and that was how he liked it. One morning, while he was walking near the barn, his phone rang. It was Joshua, one of his farm workers. Joshua sounded nervous. He said something strange had appeared in the south field. Bobby was confused. He asked what it was, but Joshua couldn't explain. He only said there was a hole, large, clean, and strange-looking. Bobby thought maybe it was a sinkhole or some kind of animal den. Still, the way Joshua spoke made him uneasy. Bobby decided to see it for himself. He got into his truck and drove across the fields. The south field was far from the main farmhouse. It was a wide, flat area that had always been quiet. There were no trees there, only grass and soil. As Bobby got closer, he saw Joshua standing at a distance. He waved Bobby over, but didn't walk too close to the hole. That made Bobby even more curious. Bobby parked his truck and walked across the dry grass. He reached Joshua and looked ahead. That's when he saw it. Right in the middle of the field, there was a large hole in the ground. It was unlike anything Bobby had seen before. The hole was wide, at least 10 feet across, and perfectly round. Its edges were smooth, too smooth for something made by nature. There was no sign of broken ground, no piles of dirt, no roots or rocks. It looked as if someone had cut a hole straight into the earth with a giant tool. He stepped closer and looked down. The hole went deep. He could not see the bottom, only darkness. He dropped a small stone in, expecting to hear it hit the ground. He waited, but there was no sound. The hole seemed endless. Bobby took a few steps back. He stared at the smooth edges again. The soil didn't look disturbed. There were no signs of collapse or pressure. It didn't look like a sinkhole or a collapsed tunnel. It looked man-made, but who would dig such a hole here in the middle of his land? He walked around it carefully. The hole was a perfect circle from every angle. The surface around it was untouched. No machine marks, no shovel marks, no tracks, no signs of anything. It made no sense. Joshua stood silently nearby. He kept glancing down into the hole, then looking away. Bobby felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't peace either. It was a heavy feeling like something was out of place. He thought back to the night before. There had been no storms, no strange noises, no equipment left in the fields. Everything had been normal. There was no way a hole like this could appear overnight without someone noticing. But there it was, plain as day, deep, dark, and smooth as glass. Bobby tried to think of reasons. Could it be an old well? But there had never been a well there. Could it be a trick? Maybe kids from town playing a prank. But no one could dig something like this in one night. Not without tools, noise, or mess. He thought about old stories he had heard as a child. Stories about hidden things underground. Lost tunnels, buried places, strange openings. But those were just tales. Still, the hole in front of him looked like something from those stories. The sun moved higher in the sky. The light did not help. The inside of the hole stayed dark. Bobby tried shining his phone's flashlight into it, but the beam stopped after a short distance. The darkness inside was thick, like it swallowed light. That made him feel uneasy again. Something about it didn't feel right. He looked at Joshua. The young man was pale. He hadn't moved much since Bobby arrived. His eyes stayed on the hole, but his feet stayed far from the edge. Bobby felt the same way. He didn't want to get too close. Not yet. Not until he understood what it was. He looked around the field again. Everything else was normal. The grass swayed in the breeze. Birds flew overhead. The sky was clear. Only the hole broke the peace. Only the hole made the air feel different. Bobby rubbed the back of his neck. He could feel sweat even though the morning was cool. He walked back to his truck and got a long stick from the back. He returned to the hole and tried to lower it inside. The stick went down for a while, but then it stopped. Not because it hit something, but because it wasn't long enough. The hole was deeper than he expected. Much deeper. Bobby stepped back and looked again. He had a choice to make. He could call someone. Maybe the police or some kind of expert. Or he could check it out himself. He didn't like calling others without knowing what was going on. It was his land, his field, his problem. He needed to think. The hole was not just strange, it was unnatural. He took a few pictures with his phone. He wanted to have proof. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he wanted to remember how it looked. He saved the images and put the phone in his pocket. Then he stood silently beside Joshua. The wind passed over them. It whistled gently through the grass. But the hole stayed quiet. Not a sound came from it. No wind, no air, no noise. Just deep, black silence. Bobby did not know what it was. But he knew one thing for sure. That hole had not always been there. And now that it was, something had changed. Bobby returned to the farmhouse after looking at the hole. His boots were still dusty, and his mind was full of questions. The image of the hole stayed in his head. He could not stop thinking about how clean and perfect it looked. He had never seen anything like it. He felt something inside telling him he had to know more. He could not leave it alone. Inside the house, he washed his hands and sat at the table. His wife, Brittany, noticed he was quiet. She asked him if something was wrong. He told her about the hole, but not all the details. He said it looked strange and deep, and he wanted to go down and see what was inside. Brittany looked concerned. She didn't like the idea. She told him it could be dangerous. She reminded him they had a peaceful life, and there was no need to take risks. Bobby listened but stayed quiet. He had already made up his mind. Later that afternoon, he went to the storage room behind the barn. It was where he kept old tools, ropes, and equipment. He had used some of these things years ago when fixing the well or checking inside tall silos. He found 2 coils of strong rope, thick gloves, and a metal hook. He tested the ropes to make sure they were still strong. Then he grabbed 2 harnesses. They were dusty but in good shape. Next, he found 2 lanterns that worked with batteries. He checked them and replaced the old batteries with fresh ones. He turned them on and saw the bright light shine across the wall. He felt better knowing they had light for the dark space below. He also packed flashlights and extra batteries, just in case. In the kitchen, he filled 2 small backpacks with supplies. He added bottles of water, some food, and a first aid kit. He also packed 2 cloths and some matches. He didn't know how long they would be down there, but he wanted to be ready. He added a notebook and a pen. He wanted to take notes if they saw anything interesting. Joshua came by in the late afternoon. He looked unsure, but followed Bobby's lead. Bobby handed him the harness and showed him the gear. They went over everything together. Bobby showed him how to wear the harness, how to tie knots, and how to test the rope before going down. Joshua listened and practiced until he felt ready. They waited until sunset. Bobby didn't want to go in during the heat of the day. The sun was low now, and the sky turned orange. The wind was soft, and the field was quiet. Bobby told Brittany they would be careful and come back soon. Brittany said very little. She stood on the porch as they loaded the gear into the truck. They drove to the south field. The hole was still there, dark and still. It hadn't changed, but it looked even more strange in the fading light. Bobby parked the truck and turned off the engine. The only sounds were the breeze and their footsteps. They placed the backpacks and lanterns on the ground and got to work. Bobby picked a strong metal rod from the truck and drove it deep into the ground near the hole. He tied the rope around it and pulled hard to test the strength. It held firm. He wrapped the other end of the rope through Joshua's harness. He made sure every loop and knot was tight. Joshua tested the weight by leaning back slowly. The rope held. Bobby handed Joshua a flashlight and told him to turn on his lantern once he reached a ledge or bottom. Joshua clipped the lantern to his belt. Bobby lowered him slowly. The rope slid through his gloves. He watched Joshua disappear into the hole, the light growing smaller. A few minutes passed. The rope moved slowly as Joshua went lower. Then the movement stopped. Bobby waited. A soft light came from the hole. Joshua had turned on the lantern. Bobby felt a little relief. Now it was his turn. He checked the second rope and tied it around his own harness. He secured it to the same metal rod and made sure it was tight. He took a deep breath, picked up his flashlight, and stepped backward toward the hole. His boots touched the edge. Then he lowered himself down. The rope was strong. His gloves helped him grip. The inside of the hole felt colder than the field above. The air was still. As he went down, the light from the surface faded. He turned on his flashlight. The beam lit the smooth walls of the hole. They were even more perfect from the inside. No cracks, no roots, no loose dirt. Just smooth, clean earth. He kept going down. He looked above once and saw only a small circle of sky. Then he looked below and saw Joshua waiting on a ledge with the lantern. He moved carefully. When he reached the ledge, he stepped off the rope and stood beside Joshua. They were both quiet. The hole was deep, but they had made it. They were underground now, standing side by side, with ropes behind them and darkness ahead. Bobby picked up his lantern from the backpack. He turned it on. The warm light spread across the space in front of them. They were ready to go further. They both held lanterns, and the warm light helped them see the space around them. The ground below the ledge looked firm, so they climbed down the last short distance. Their boots touched solid earth. It felt dry but not dusty. The air was colder than above, and the silence was thick. They looked around slowly. The hole had opened into a large underground space. It was much bigger than they expected. The walls stretched far in every direction. The ceiling was high above their heads and hidden in shadows. The space felt like a wide cave, but it didn't look natural. The walls were too even. The ground was too flat. The shapes in front of them were not made by nature. As they walked forward, their lanterns lit up stone shapes. These shapes were not rocks. They were buildings. Small ones like huts. They were made from smooth stone blocks. Some had flat roofs. Others had rounded tops. None of them looked damaged. They stood quietly, as if waiting. Bobby stepped closer to one of the huts and placed his hand on the stone. It was cold and solid. The design was simple, but the work was clean. The stones were cut perfectly, with no gaps between them. They kept walking and found more structures. Some looked like homes. Others were taller and longer. One building had thick pillars at the entrance. These pillars had lines and shapes carved into them. The patterns did not look like writing, but they repeated in a way that felt important. Bobby noticed that each building had a different design, but all were made from the same kind of stone. It was gray with tiny silver flecks that sparkled in the lantern light. As they walked deeper into the cavern, they found something even stranger. A large open space sat in the middle of the underground area. In this space stood a tall structure. It looked like a temple. It had steps leading up to a raised platform. The building was wider than the others and had many pillars in front. The top of the structure had a round shape, almost like a dome. Bobby and Joshua stared at it for a long time. It felt like the center of the whole place. They didn't climb the steps yet. Instead, they walked around the edge of the space. There, near the walls of the cavern, they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. Scattered along the walls were bones. Human bones. Some were full skeletons, others broken or mixed with dust. Many of them were curled up, as if the people had been hiding or trying to protect themselves. Some skeletons still held objects. One had a long stick with a stone tip. Another had something shaped like a small shield. A few had bags or cloths still tied around their bones. The fabric was worn and faded, but it hadn't turned to dust. Time had passed, but something about the air here had kept things preserved. Bobby bent down and looked closer. The tools and weapons were made from stone and metal. The metal looked old, but didn't have much rust. The shapes were strange, not like anything he had seen in books or museums. Joshua stood nearby, shining his lantern over the bones. The sight made the air feel heavier. They walked along the wall, passing more skeletons and broken tools. Then they noticed markings on the stone walls. These markings were painted in dark red and black. Some looked like symbols. Others showed scenes. There were people drawn with long arms and sharp features. Some were holding weapons. Others looked like they were running or falling. One section of the wall showed a large animal. It had many legs and a wide mouth. The people in the drawing were fighting it. Some of the people were lying on the ground. Others held up their hands. Bobby stared at the images. He didn't understand them, but they made him feel uneasy. Something bad had happened here a long time ago. They moved on and found more paintings. One showed people standing near a round hole in the ground. Their hands were raised. Some had lines coming from their heads, like light or fire. Another painting showed dark shapes falling from above. The last one in the row showed empty land, with only the temple still standing. Bobby looked back at the center of the cavern. The temple still stood tall and quiet. The light from their lanterns flickered on its smooth walls. The silence around them was complete. No wind, no sounds, just the soft steps of their boots and the quiet breathing of two men trying to understand what they had found. They didn't speak. There was no need. The cavern said enough. It had been hidden for a long time, but now it had been seen again. The stone buildings, the strange tools, the painted walls, and the bones, all of it told a story that neither of them could yet explain. But they were not done exploring. They moved slowly, careful not to trip or step on anything important. The carvings on the walls continued around the temple. Some were large and bold, while others were small and hidden between stones. The symbols looked even stranger up close. Some shapes looked like eyes. Others looked like stars or fire. None of it made sense to them, but something about the drawings felt serious. It was clear that someone long ago had tried to tell a story here. Joshua walked near one of the side walls, where the ground was uneven. He stepped over a cracked stone and noticed something shiny in the dirt. It was half buried near a pile of broken rocks. He bent down and brushed away some dust. The object was smooth and silver, with a shape he didn't recognize. It was not round, square, or anything simple. It looked almost like a key, but not like any key they had ever seen. The object had straight lines and sharp corners. Its surface was clean, even though it had been buried for who knew how long. There were small lines cut into the metal, like tiny paths or circuits. At the top, there was a circle with a hole in the middle. The metal was cold and heavy. Joshua picked it up and held it in the lantern light. Bobby walked over and looked at it closely. He took it from Joshua and turned it in his hand. The object felt smooth but firm. It was not made of any metal he could name. It wasn't rusty. It wasn't scratched. It looked like it had not aged at all. Bobby turned it over and saw more tiny lines on the back. These lines didn't form words, but they looked like they had meaning. He slipped the object into his pocket. He didn't know what it was, but it felt important. The weight of it pressed against his leg as he walked. Something about it made him feel nervous. It was not like the tools and weapons they had found near the bones. This was different. This was something more advanced. Something not meant to be found. The air inside the cavern started to feel different. It was not warmer, but heavier. Breathing felt slower. Bobby and Joshua both noticed it. They didn't say anything, but they stopped walking. They listened. The silence was still there, but it felt less calm now, like the space around them was watching. They stood still for a few minutes. The light from their lanterns flickered slightly, as if the air had shifted. The walls seemed to press in just a little. Bobby took a step back and looked at the temple again. The building had not changed, but it now felt more distant, like it was holding a secret. Joshua walked toward the wall with the drawings and looked again at the last image. The people in the painting looked like they were running from something. Lines above them looked like fire or light falling from the sky. The ground in the drawing was cracked, and the people were small and spread out. It did not look like a peaceful story. It looked like something had gone wrong. Bobby stood near the edge of the open space and looked down at the floor. There were cracks in the stone that didn't match the carvings. These cracks looked newer. Some dust had gathered around them, but not much. It seemed like the ground had shifted sometime after the place was built. That added to the strange feeling. They walked slowly around the temple, but did not go inside. The front steps were covered in dust and small stones. No footprints, no signs of movement. The door was closed, or maybe just a wall. There was no handle or opening they could see, only more carvings. The same strange symbols circled the top of the entrance. Bobby felt the object in his pocket again. He didn't pull it out this time. He just touched it through the cloth. The metal was still cold. The shape of it rested against his fingers, firm and real. It reminded him that this was not a dream. Everything they were seeing was really here. The deeper they walked, the more they saw signs of something terrible. The broken bones, the scattered tools, the pictures on the walls, all of it pointed to a time of trouble. Not just the passing of time, but a real event. Something had ended this place. Something sudden, something big, but nothing had come to take it away. The structures were still standing. The bones were still where they fell. The drawings had not faded. Everything waited in silence, hidden under the earth, until the hole in Bobby's field opened the way. He stood still again and looked around the cavern. It was large, quiet, and full of shadows. The lantern light only reached so far. Beyond the edge of the light, the darkness stayed thick. Bobby did not want to step too far from the center. The strange feeling in the air kept him close. Joshua walked back to his side. They stood together, not speaking. The silence around them felt heavier than before. They both knew they had seen something that was not meant to be seen. The object in Bobby's pocket, the carvings, the bones, the temple, all of it pointed to something deeper, something old, something dangerous. But they didn't yet understand what it was. The floor was made of large stone slabs. Some were cracked, but most were solid. As they stepped, they felt a soft vibration under their feet. It was so small that at first they thought it was their imagination. They paused and waited. Then the feeling came again, slight but real. The ground trembled. The light from the lanterns flickered. Bobby looked up. Tiny bits of dust began to fall from the high ceiling above. He looked down and saw the cracks in the floor, spreading wider. One long crack split a stone slab near the temple and ran toward the wall. The ground shook again, this time harder. Loose stones fell from the edges of the temple roof. The walls groaned. A low, deep sound moved through the cavern like a wave. The stillness was gone. The ground was waking up. More dust filled the air. The tremor grew into a steady rumble. Stones dropped from the ceiling and landed with sharp echoes. The light shook in their hands. The floor under them moved slightly, then again with more force. A loud snap came from the far end of the cavern. One of the stone huts collapsed. Blocks hit the ground and shattered. A cloud of dirt rose into the air. Bobby turned and looked at the path they had taken earlier. The way back was now covered in fallen stones. Some parts of the floor were cracked open. The smooth surface they had walked on was broken. The ground jumped again, harder than before. Both men stumbled. The lantern in Joshua's hand fell and rolled across the floor. The light flickered but stayed on. Bobby grabbed his own lantern tightly and pointed it at the wall where they had entered. More dust and rocks were falling. The rope they had used to climb down still hung, but the wall around it was cracking. They knew they had to leave. The cavern was not safe anymore. The shaking grew stronger. The roof above the temple made a loud groaning sound. A large piece of stone broke loose and crashed to the floor, sending sharp fragments in all directions. They ran. Their boots hit the ground hard as they moved around the fallen blocks. The cracks in the floor widened. Each step felt like it might be the last solid one. More structures fell behind them. The walls began to shift. Paintings and carvings split apart as stones tumbled down. The rope still held, swinging slightly. The wall around it was unstable, but it was their only way out. Bobby reached it first. He dropped his lantern and grabbed the rope. His hands tightened around it, and he began to climb. The rope swayed with each movement, brushing against the rough stone wall. He climbed fast. Dust and stones rained down from above. As he pulled himself up, the shaking did not stop. It got worse. Cracks raced up the walls. Loose rocks slid down the surface. Bobby kept climbing, his arms burning, his breath short. He didn't look down. Behind him, Joshua grabbed the rope. He climbed quickly, but had to dodge falling rocks. A large piece of stone fell past him and hit the ground with a loud crash. The cavern below was collapsing. The floor split open. The temple leaned to one side, then began to break apart. Bobby reached the top and pulled himself out. He rolled onto the grass, gasping for air. The sky above was calm, but the ground under him still moved. He turned and looked down into the hole. Dust rose in thick clouds. Stones cracked and fell. He saw Joshua still climbing. Joshua reached the edge and Bobby pulled him up. They both fell back, coughing and covered in dirt. Behind them, the hole groaned. A deep sound came from the earth, louder than before. Then the walls of the hole gave in. Rocks tumbled down, filling the space. The rope was pulled inside and disappeared. The opening shrank as more dirt and stone fell into it. Within minutes, the perfect hole was gone. In its place was a pile of broken earth and dust. The ground had closed itself. Bobby and Joshua lay still, staring at the place where the hole had been. Their clothes were torn, and their hands were scraped. Their bodies ached, but they were alive. The air was clearer up here, but something heavy still hung around them. The sound of the collapse stayed in their ears. Bobby sat up and reached into his pocket. The object was still there, the cold metal pressed against his fingers. He looked at it again in the light. It had not changed. The same strange lines and smooth shape. It was the only thing left from below. They sat in silence as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The field around them was quiet again, but the ground had shifted. The hole was buried. The cavern was gone. What had been hidden for so long was now lost again. Bobby and Joshua sat in the field, breathing slowly. Dust still floated in the air. The ground where the hole had been was now a pile of broken earth. The clean, smooth opening was gone. Rocks and soil had filled it in. There was no way back inside. Only the memory remained. Bobby pulled the object from his pocket and looked at it again. The metal still felt cold. Its surface was smooth and strange. The lines on it caught the sunlight. It looked out of place on a quiet farm. Joshua sat beside him, quiet and tired. Their clothes were torn. Their hands were scraped. But they were alive. The sky above was clear, and the wind had returned. It was hard to believe something so big had just happened beneath their feet. Bobby stood up slowly and looked across the field. He knew this was bigger than him. He could not explain what he saw. He could not keep it a secret. He needed to tell someone. He walked back to his truck and grabbed his phone. His hands were shaking. He called the local police and told them there had been a collapse on his land. He didn't share every detail. He just said it was serious and needed attention. Within an hour, 2 patrol cars arrived. The officers stepped out and looked at the damaged ground. Bobby explained what had happened. He said the ground had given way. He said it was deeper than it looked. The officers took notes. One of them called for backup. Later that day, more vehicles arrived. Fire trucks, rescue teams, and a few people in protective suits. They set up barriers around the area. Bright tape was tied to stakes in the ground. Radios crackled. People moved with purpose. Bobby stood back and watched. The experts asked questions. Bobby answered what he could. He said he and Joshua had gone down to check the hole. He said it was not normal. He described the smooth walls, the structures, and the carvings. He told them about the bones. He showed them where the hole had been. Someone took pictures. Others measured the ground. A team brought ground scanners and tools. They moved carefully, checking for signs of another collapse. They asked Bobby to stay nearby. They wanted to talk to him again. News spread fast. By the next morning, reporters arrived. Cameras were set up along the edge of the field. People from town drove in to see what was happening. Bobby's quiet farm became the center of attention. Strangers stood behind the tape, pointing and asking questions. A group of scientists arrived in marked vans. They wore white coats and carried special equipment. They spoke with the police and looked at the ground with serious faces. Some walked around slowly, tapping the soil. Others looked at satellite maps and old land records. Bobby showed them the object. He told them where Joshua had found it. The scientists gathered around. They passed it from hand to hand. They took photos and notes. They asked if anyone had touched it without gloves. Bobby said he had. They told him to place it in a sealed box for safety. They didn't say what it was. They didn't know. One of the scientists tried to scan it with a small machine. The screen flashed, but no information came up. The object did not match any known metal. It did not respond to magnets. It did not show signs of age. It was like something new, yet clearly old. That night, Bobby could not sleep. The noise from the reporters and machines had died down, but his mind was full. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The object was now locked in a metal case in his storage room. The key sat beside it. He could still feel the cold weight of it in his hand. In the morning, the scientists returned. They brought more equipment. They set up tents and computers. They drilled small holes into the ground to take samples. They asked more questions. They wanted to know when Bobby had first seen the hole. They wanted to know about the rope, the lanterns, and the carvings. Bobby answered again, slowly and clearly. By the third day, government officials arrived. They wore dark suits and spoke quietly. They walked with the scientists and looked serious. They did not speak to the reporters. They only spoke to the lead officers and the head scientist. A new fence was built around the area. Security guards were placed at the gate. Signs were posted. Private property. No entry. The local news reported the site as a land collapse with unknown cause. But people in town whispered other things. They said it was a secret dig. They said something had been found underground. Bobby kept quiet. He stayed at the edge of the field and watched. The land he had worked for years now belonged to something else. Experts took control. Machines scanned the earth. Lights were placed on poles and stayed on through the night. One evening, Bobby stood by the fence and looked at the spot. It was quiet again. The crowd was gone. The machines were turned off for the night. The only sound was the wind in the grass. He thought of the drawings. He thought of the bones. He thought of the object in the box. Whatever had been under his farm, it had changed everything. He was no longer just a farmer. He was now part of something larger, something no one could explain. The days passed slowly. The land where the hole had been was now silent again. The field looked calm, but something about it felt different. The fence was still there. The warning signs were still posted. The scientists had stopped digging for now. The machines were turned off, and the visitors had gone home. But Bobby could not forget. He walked to the edge of the field each morning. He stood still and looked at the ground. The hole was gone. The smooth circle had been filled in during the collapse. Nothing remained on the surface. But in his mind, it was all still there. The dark descent, the stone buildings, the drawings, the bones. Most of all, he kept thinking about the object. The strange key was now locked in a case inside his storage room. He kept the room shut and never let anyone inside. Only he had the key. He checked on it every day. He would open the case, look at the object, and close it again. He never touched it with bare hands anymore. He wore gloves, just like the scientists had done. The object had not changed. It still looked smooth and new. The lines on it still glowed, slightly under light. The metal still felt too cold for something kept at room temperature. No rust, no damage, no sign of age. The scientists had taken pictures and samples, but they had found nothing. They told Bobby it was made of a metal they could not fully identify. They said the shape and design did not match anything known on Earth. Some thought it was part of a machine. Others said it might be a symbol. But no one was sure. That was what bothered Bobby the most. No one was sure. He thought about the drawings on the walls. He thought about the people holding their hands to the sky. He thought about the pictures that showed fire and cracks in the earth. He remembered the bones lying near tools. He remembered how the temple had looked untouched, as if waiting. The questions never stopped. What had the key opened? Why had it been left behind? Who had made it? Why had the people below died? Why had everything stayed hidden for so long? Had someone meant for it to stay hidden forever? Bobby could not sleep well. At night, he dreamed of the hole. He dreamed of the silence in the cavern. He dreamed of walking between the stone huts. Sometimes he saw shadows in the dreams, shapes that moved without sound. He always woke up before reaching the temple. He began reading late at night. He searched for books and old records. He looked up stories about hidden cities and underground temples. He read about lost cultures, ancient wars, and strange objects found deep in the ground. Most of it was just myths, but parts of it felt close to what he had seen. He kept his thoughts to himself. The reporters had stopped calling. The news had moved on. The scientists had not returned in days. The people in town still talked, but not as much as before. Some said it was just a sinkhole. Others said the government had covered up something big. No one had answers. Only Bobby still searched. He stopped working on the farm. Joshua took over the daily tasks. Brittany noticed Bobby was changing. He was quieter. He ate less. He stayed in the storage room for hours. Sometimes he would just sit and stare at the case. The object had a strange pull. Bobby could not explain it. He felt like it was calling him, though it made no sound. It gave no light. It stayed still in the box. But he could not look away. He began to draw it on paper. He traced the lines and tried to copy the patterns. He did not know why. It just felt like something he needed to do. Each time he looked at the object, a thought returned to him. The cavern was gone, but not everything below had been destroyed. The temple had been strong. The walls had been thick. Some parts could still be there. Deeper down, hidden again, waiting. He began to wonder if the hole had opened by accident or for a reason. Maybe it was not just a crack in the ground. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe the land was trying to reveal something that had been buried for ages. The idea grew in his mind. He started walking around the field at night. He used a flashlight and watched the ground. He looked for small cracks or signs of change. He listened for sounds beneath the soil. He pressed his ear to the ground once, but heard only silence. Still, he did not stop. The obsession grew stronger. He started drawing maps. He marked the location of the hole. He wrote notes about what he saw underground. He made lists of the carvings, the buildings, and the bones. He tried to remember the shape of each structure and where they were placed. He filled notebooks with sketches and words. He no longer cared about crops or weather. He cared only about what had been lost. The mystery stayed with him. It was always just beneath the surface, like the cavern had been. The object reminded him that there was more to find. The land was quiet now, but it held secrets. Bobby knew he could not forget. He could not let it go. Something was waiting. Something deep. Something that no one else could see or feel. And one day, he might go back to find it. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for all your support.